I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Honey, whatever.
This is Magda Brown. I was introduced to Magda by a rabbi friend of mine, Lisa Bellows, who you'll hear from later on in this episode. Magda is 92 years old and possesses an optimistic zest for life. She lives with her daughter Rochelle and dog Wrigley. As you might guess, they're avid Cubs fans.
I'm going to kick him out right away. Wrigley, sit down.
When were you born?
June 11, 1927. So I was born and raised in Hungary in an Orthodox Jewish family. Here is Budapest, and to the east, Miskolc, Miskolc. My father owned a meat market, and my mother and father were working a lot. But then, of course, Friday night, Saturday, the family was at home together. It was the normalcy of Jewish life in those days. Interestingly, in Hungary, 90% of the people speak German. Not only that, but my parents sent me to private German class twice a week. But it became helpful later on. The Nazis, they came in March 1944. The first order was all the people to have a Jewish Star of David sewed on their clothing. Next move, order that all Jewish people from the smaller communities were moved in on foot to the big city where they created a ghetto. As it happens, my home in the big city became part of the ghetto. We were 6 people living in the house. My parents, my brother and I, and an aunt and uncle. So now the police brought in the people from the outlying areas, and they just shoved a bunch of people into a house. My home became the residency for 40 people. At the end of April, we get an order that we are going to be moved to another country because they need laborers. That was the smartest blow you could ever imagine. Reason? We didn't resist. We didn't fight. This is the height of the war. It's very, very understandable. They need workers. So we figured, okay, we go wherever it has to be. We'll do our job. The war will be over. We go home and life will be good. Unfortunately, it doesn't play out this way. So on my 17th birthday, they shoved us into these boxcars. We were 70 to 75 people squashed into that space. There was only a bucket for toiletry and a bucket for water, except the bucket of water was never, ever refilled. In order to allow my parents to sit on the wooden floor, I stood for 3 solid days, shifting from this end to that end. So we're traveling, and about the 3rd day, they opened the doors on this boxcar, and a man wearing a striped uniform come aboard. But what they're trying to tell you is, leave your packages in the car, you will get it later. Once we exited this train, we are in the facilities of Auschwitz proper. Then we have to line up, men in one column, women in another column. Now we are women and children. And now comes the sorting. You are lined up 5 abreast, just like soldiers. You are facing a group of Nazi officers. Point at me, go this way. And my very, very young-looking 42-year-old mother, who was holding on to me, that away. So I waved to her. I said, "Mother, I'll see you later." Unfortunately, later never comes.
My name is Alex Lang, and you are listening to Restorative Faith, my podcast for those who question and doubt. The goal of this podcast is to recast Christianity in a new light. This season is about evil and its role in driving people away from the church. Again, because we are talking about issues pertaining to evil, there may be some content that is not appropriate for younger listeners. For the last 3 episodes, we have explored how the Bible accounts for the presence of evil in the world. We've discussed the original sin of Adam and Eve, the role of angels and demons, and the curse of generational sin. In this episode, we are going to discuss what is perhaps the most cited reason for rejecting God and the church, the atrocity of genocide. Genocide is the deliberate killing of a large group of people who are targeted specifically because they are associated with a particular ethnic group or nation. Genocide is often thought of as the greatest human evil. The reason why is because genocide is murder on a massive scale. It takes planning, direction, and above all, a complete abandonment of the moral compass that holds our society together. The most famous genocide of the 20th century was the Nazi Holocaust of World War II, in which Magda and 6 million other Jews, along with 4 million other people whom the Nazis labeled undesirable, were transported to concentration camps to be exterminated and worked to death. Because the magnitude of human life lost during the Nazi genocide was on a scale never previously seen in human history, it has become the primary point of reference for how we think of genocides. Indeed, because the Nazi Holocaust casts such a dark shadow, many people believe that genocides are rare events. Unfortunately, this is not the case. During the 20th century alone, there were 32 separate genocides around the world. Sadly, the Jewish Holocaust was only one. In my experience, the reason why these types of events can often cause a personal crisis of faith is due to the way people struggle with the question how. How could such a thing ever be allowed to happen? How could a human being ever commit such an atrocity? And most importantly, how could a truly all-good and loving God allow this to happen? Why didn't God intervene to stop these people from being slaughtered? If God can part the Red Sea to rescue the Israelites from the Egyptians, shouldn't God do the same for the Jews being led into the gas chambers? These are the types of questions that must be answered if the church is going to maintain any moral authority to speak to the presence of evil in the world. To begin exploring these questions, I want to turn back to our story from Magda Brown.
They take us into a room, a completely empty room, just wooden floor, nothing else. Order. Disrobe completely, fold up your clothes, put it down on the floor. Remember where you left your clothing. You'll get it later. That's another fantasy. And then as this procedure is taking place, from the adjacent room, there are some girls coming out and they are screaming from the top of their lungs. What has taken place in that adjacent room was they shaved our hair bald. All our body hair was shaven. And if that's not enough, they sprayed disinfectant on the freshly shaven skin. I don't recommend it. So now we look literally unrecognizable. It took a while until I would look into your eyes and listen to your voice. And then connect the two, and somehow, after a while, we got acclimated to it and we would recognize one another. We are there for about 2, 3, 4 days, something like that. And we asked the old-timers. Old-timer means who have been there longer, not age-wise. Could you tell us how soon we're going to see the family who went that away? They raised their arm, pointed to the 5 chimneys. That is where your parents are. Oh, come on. I mean, we were in absolute, total denial. You know, this is barbarism. I mean, what are you talking about? But as the days passed, we saw those chimneys spewing out heavy black smoke. And there was an odor that I usually best describe when you kill a chicken and you put it over flame to remove the feather. That's the kind of burning we get smelling, but you just can't understand that.
Magda's reluctance to accept the reality of what was happening, even though she was in the middle of the Auschwitz concentration camp, is understandable. The idea that a whole country would commit massive amounts of resources to rounding up millions of individuals simply to kill them is almost unimaginable. And yet, it was happening right before Magda's eyes. So the question that we need to explore is, how did this horror film become a reality? I posed this question to Dr. Peter Lourgos, a forensic psychiatrist who specializes in examining criminal behavior. And his answer to this question started in a place I hadn't anticipated. He began by talking about anxiety.
Anxiety somehow is interrelated to this effect of being an internal clock for your behaviors. So let's take a child who is anxious. That child, when they're stepping outside of what they should be doing, and even small children have a sense of what's right and wrong, anxiety is the internal clock that makes you feel bad when you're engaging in certain behaviors. So individuals with high anxiety are not really going to be apt to be doing those behaviors on their own. People that are sociopathic individuals, or what we call as severe antisocials who engage in serial killer-like behaviors, they often have no anxiety. That's one of the reasons why they pass lie detector tests. So a lie detector test basically measures levels of anxiety in an individual. So when you're anxious, your heart rate goes up. When you're anxious, your voice changes. And that's what a lie detector tests, because most people with normal levels of anxiety, when they're lying or being deceptive, their internal clock starts going on and they start showing all these signs which you can detect they're lying.
So anxiety is important because anxiety and morality are actually linked together. In Christianity, we often think of morality in terms of behaviors that God deems right or wrong. For instance, the Bible tells us that stealing is morally wrong. According to the Bible, the reason why you shouldn't steal is because God frowns upon stealing. If you steal someone else's stuff, God will be upset with you. But outside of religion, the reason why we don't steal is because if everyone is taking each other's stuff, then it creates instability in human society. This is why humans create rules or laws to prevent that instability from wreaking havoc on our communities. If you steal, society imposes consequences on you. Seen through this lens, morality is really just a bunch of rules that maintain order. And what Dr. Lourgos is saying is that these rules work because they play on our anxiety.
There is a link, though, to anxiety and the development of morality as we know it. So many times these kids that has these low anxiety traits engage in pretty specific behaviors. They'll torture animals. And when you think about that, most kids who have regular levels of anxiety are going to feel bad. They're going to say, this is wrong. This animal's in distress. But you take a child that has no anxiety. Harming an animal is just like, maybe flying a kite or something. Like it doesn't elicit any type of response from them at all. Morality's fixed with rules. These are acceptable behaviors. This is what society as a collective whole from a legal point of view. And in religion, morality is viewed as these are behaviors that are acceptable. So anxiety seems to be linked in some capacity to learn what rules should be.
This link between anxiety and rule following is critically important to understanding what happened in the Holocaust. After stories of what transpired in the concentration camps began to circulate around the world, people began to ask the question, how could these soldiers have carried out these actions? Were they morally bankrupt? Do the Germans possess some kind of evil gene that makes them all sociopaths? The answer to this question came from an unlikely place. In 1963, a psychologist from Yale University named Stanley Milgram published the results from an experiment entitled Behavioral Study of Obedience. Here's how the experiment worked. 2 volunteers would be brought into a lab and told they were going to be conducting a memory test. One person would be the teacher, the other person would be the learner. The volunteers would draw slips to determine who would serve each function. They would then be escorted into separate rooms by the scientists conducting the experiment. The learner was strapped to a chair and connected to a device that delivered an electric shock. The teacher was escorted into a separate room where he or she could ask questions to the learner. If the learner got a question wrong, then the teacher was asked to administer an electric shock. With each wrong question, the teacher was supposed to increase the voltage of that shock. What the teacher didn't know is that the learner and the scientist were both actors. The learner was not actually being shocked, but only acting as if that were the case. The actor playing the scientist was instructed to watch the teacher, and if the teacher protested going forward with the experiment, the scientist was supposed to give 4 responses in this order. First, please continue. Second, The experiment requires that you continue. Third, it is absolutely essential that you continue. Fourth, you have no other choice. You must go on. If the subject still protested after these 4 verbal responses, then the experiment was discontinued. To get a sense of what it was like to participate in this experiment, I want to play some audio from the original Milgram experiment that took place in 1963.
Neil, you're gonna get a shock, 180 volts.
Ow! I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
Can't
here.
stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man there. You hear him hollering?
As I said before, the shocks may be painful, but
yeah,
they're not
but he's in
dangerous.
there hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not gonna get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
I
pairs.
refuse to take the responsibility. I'm getting hurt in there. You know, I'm not. I mean, he's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here, and I mean, geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. Answer, please.
What's amazing about this experiment is that 65% of all the subjects continued to administer shocks up to the very highest levels, which, if those shocks had been real, would have resulted in death. These subjects were just your average, everyday people, and yet, in a very short period of time, they found themselves in a position where they could have been culpable for murder.
Well, I figured 200, the voltage were given were quite a bit. I wanted to stop, but he kept insisting not to stop. I mean, the fellow in there is hollering. He says, I don't want to do it. I want to get out of here. I want to get out of here.
Why didn't you stop anyway?
I did stop, but he kept going, keep going.
Well, why didn't you just disregard what he said?
He says it's got to go on, the experiment.
We often think of the soldiers who worked in the concentration camps as being morally bankrupt. We assume these soldiers were evil human beings who had no moral compass. But like the subjects in the Milgram experiment, most Nazi soldiers were your average, everyday people. So why did they follow through with the genocide of millions of people? It's the same reason why Milgram's subjects were willing to shock to the death: anxiety. The higher your levels of anxiety, the more likely you are to be a rule follower. And in most people's minds, when you're given an order by a person in authority, whether that person be a scientist or a commanding officer, we believe the right thing to do is to obey that authority figure, even if what they're telling us to do feels wrong. Again, Dr. Lourgos.
When it comes to society's rules, you want people to be compliant with society. So a lot of it too is innate in our upbringing, that you're supposed to follow rules. You're supposed to do what your leader tells you. But where do you make the connection where you say, I'm not doing what you want to do? So that's what I tell parents. Sometimes when parents find that kids aren't always following the rules, that's not always a bad trait, because that trait of questioning, that trait of not always being compliant when the person's thinking on their own is not always a negative trait. It makes a difficult child many times to raise, because the parent's like, why aren't you following this rule? Why don't you do this? I told you to be in at this time. And the child's like, well, why do I have to be at home at that specific time? Or why this doesn't make sense? Those are not always negative traits, because those are traits that when it comes to a point where someone's telling you to do something, where your own moral compass is telling you, I probably shouldn't be doing this, those are the people that are less likely to do that.
And it's almost the way that you're saying this to me, it's making me imagine that it's simply a fact of this person at the top, which is getting back to the Milgram, the authority figure.
Right.
If the authority figure is leading you in the wrong direction and you're compliant, you as an average person, if you're not going to stand up and say, hey, that's morally wrong, you more than likely are going to follow down that path just because you've been taught to be compliant all along, and you don't have that desire to say, hey, well, wait a second, that's not the way that it should be. Right. It sounds like what you're saying. Am I correct in that?
That's correct.
The hard reality of the Milgram experiment is how it highlights our own culpability. Even though we would like to believe that we could never participate in such an atrocity as the Holocaust, Milgram proves that we absolutely could. Which leads us to the heart of this episode. Given that ordinary, average people are capable of committing absolutely horrific crimes, where was God when all of this was happening? The Jews are God's people, right? Why didn't God intervene to save them from the slaughter of the gas chambers? To get the Jewish perspective on this question, I interviewed Rabbi Lisa Bellows. Rabbi Bellows has participated with me in several interfaith gatherings. She's an inspirational leader who knows how to speak to the heart of challenging issues.
The questions of God after the Holocaust did not come immediately after the Holocaust, right? So for the first almost decade, maybe decade and a half, we were still trying to put the pieces together. So Elie Wiesel wrote Night, published in 1956. He's really credited with asking the questions that led to post-Holocaust theology. So he's asking, where was God? Was God in Auschwitz? And how do we relate to a God now? So he doesn't answer them, but he asks the questions.
Rabbi Bellows explained to me that there are 4 streams of thought that came out of the Holocaust. The first comes from the teacher Richard Rubinstein, who wrote the book After Auschwitz, in which he proclaims that God is dead because if a God did exist, what kind of God would allow the Holocaust to transpire? The second comes from the Orthodox rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, who wrote a book called Faith After the Holocaust, in which he says that in order for humans to have free will, God had to hide. God was present in the Holocaust, but hiding away. The third comes from the philosopher Emil Fackenheim, who believes that because of the Holocaust, God has given the Jews a new commandment. They are to never allow Hitler to have a posthumous victory. However, it is the fourth stream of thought where Rabbi Bellows derives the most comfort.
I think the theologian that I relate to most on this idea is Abraham Joshua Heschel, modern prophet. He says God's there, we have free will, and it's not that God chose to hide, like Berkovitz says, but rather we weren't seeking God. We shut God out. And so the question is not, Heschel says, where is God? The question is, where are we? Where were we? Although we have free will, God exists in our life, and it is our obligation as covenantal partners with God to bring God back, God's presence, and that is done through prayer, through following commandments, and mostly also for Heschel, social justice. I think God works through our hands and feet and minds and souls. And that's also how we experience God, how we can experience the power of holiness. It's through connection.
If Heschel is correct, then what this tells us is that God is not going to reach into the world and magically alter the course of events. This is important because although the stories in the Bible relay that God can miraculously part the seas and save the Israelites from harm, this is not how God actually works in the world. If it was, then I think we could all agree that the one time when God would have reached into our world to intervene is during the Holocaust. But that didn't happen. The only way the Jews in the camps were saved was through the hands and feet of the people who were willing to risk themselves to save the Jewish people. What this tells us is that if God is going to intervene, then God is going to intervene through us. Which brings me to another important point in this episode. One of the common refrains in the Christian faith is that by following Jesus, we are somehow less susceptible to evil and more likely to make good choices. But the Holocaust speaks against this theology. The vast majority of the people who committed the atrocities of the Holocaust identified as Christian. Their involvement in the Christian religion made little to no difference in their willingness to stop the machinery of Hitler's final solution. So I asked Rabbi Bellows, in her mind, what makes the difference between the person who is compliant with the orders of genocide and the person who is willing to be God's hands and feet in the world to stop the Holocaust?
The way a Jewish person studies is with somebody else so that we can wrestle with the text, wrestle with understanding those rules. understanding how is it that we, fulfill our purpose in life, being in a relationship with God and partnership with God and fixing the world, making it better, and how can we approach the mitzvot, the commandments, for our life today in this time and particular place. Wrestling makes us see the other as a human being, because sometimes putting ourselves into maybe uncomfortable places or out of our comfort zone to meet the other, who is often perceived as the enemy, when we do that, when we even wrestle with our own inclination to not do that, the reward is acknowledging somebody else's humanity.
This reward is the key to overcoming evil in our world. The more you are willing to wrestle with the position of the other, the more likely you are to recognize that person's humanity, the less likely you are to inflict harm on that person. You cannot hurt something that you feel is of equal value to yourself. And the Nazis understood how human compassion would be a barrier to the extermination process. That's why they shaved the hair of Magda Brown and all the other Jews. It's much easier to kill someone when you feel they are less than human. But Magda survived the Holocaust in spite of this dehumanization. How she managed to survive is a combination of luck, perseverance, and basic human kindness. When we last left off, Magda had just been brought into the Auschwitz concentration camp.
In Auschwitz, there was an empty room that would hold 200 people lying down on the floor. But they managed to put in 500 scientifically, like sardines in the can. That's how we lay down on this simple wooden floor, hundreds in a row. We had to lay sideways to have enough room. Our flip-flops were our pillow. The body heat was the blanket. And every day we had to go out into the courtyard. We had to line up in a circle. And a group of Nazi officers were selecting us. But we didn't know for what. We had to disrobe our upper shoulder just to see if our upper arm is strong enough. So the lucky ones were in one column, and the weaker ones, only God has the answer for where they are. By early August of the summer, very rapidly, they selected 1,000 Hungarian Jewish women. Within hours, we were out of the camp on a train. That is the reason I don't have a tattoo, because they were anxious to put us in the labor market. So now we are traveling, and we end up in a community called Allendorf, and this had one of the largest ammunition factory that we know of. They manufactured rockets and bombs. The factories were built going downwards. The roof was flat, sodded, and trees were growing out of it. So when the Allied reconnaissance planes were searching the area, they saw nothing else but a meadow. It was so beautifully camouflaged. Now, once we arrived to this location, they housed us in an old World War II deserted army barracks. So our living conditions have improved, because now we had a bunk bed to sleep on, 16 people in a room, and it had a table, and ironically, it even had lockers, but we had nothing to put in there. The supervisors were German old men who were no longer military age. So there was this nice old man, about 70 years old. I am 17, he is 70. And that man risked his life to bring me green apples from his home. I will never forget his kindness. Amidst all the tragedies, one dot of human kindness. Now we are into about 5 months of working in the factory. January, February, something like that. And we look at each other, and now, if your hair was black, now it's orange. Your face is lemon yellow, and your lips are deep, dark purple. What has taken place? We were working with that highly poisonous liquid material without any protective garments, and it started invading our body. the head supervisor of the German unit, a civilian, but I guess he was the factory manager or big position. I don't know why God directed him to me, but he kind of befriended me. And one day he says, "Come with me," took me to his office and gave me a scarf so I could cover my head or my face when the powder was coming. So now we go fast forward to about March of 45. We are ordered to line up, and they put us on the open highway where we are wearing only a thin spring coat, no leggings, nothing, and it's cold. It is cold. So we are marching to the unknown for 3 solid days. During the night, we are sleeping on the wet ground in the ditches. And you'll be surprised how when you're tired, you can sleep anywhere. On the 3rd day, we are approaching a village area, and we are stopping in front of like a wheat field or something. A group of us girls are standing there and spotting a barn about 2 city blocks in and start fantasizing. How would it be if during the night we crawl on our stomach and hide in the barn? So we proceeded to arrive to the barn at night, and naturally we were shaking in our boots because they find us, they kill us, it will be all over. So the next morning, we see 2 young men approaching us. They wear a strange uniform. Well, it turned out to be 2 fantastic GIs from the 6th Armored Division, God bless them all, who have liberated us.
Did you ever hold any anger at the time that you were going through all of this? I mean, you lost your parents to that.
How do I think about the Nazi captors? It was a tragic era in life. But when I preach don't hate, then why should I hate? In my analysis, let's say that you were a Nazi guard. Now you are an old man. You have ears to hear the cries, even at your old age. You have eyes to see what you have seen. You have nose to smell the crematorium. You have to live with that all your dying days. So I feel that that's enough for that person to go through.
What Magda's story has made clear to me is that at the center of the tragedy of the Holocaust is the need for forgiveness. Given the opportunity to go back in time and do it all over again, I know the vast majority of Germans who were complicit in the Holocaust would have chosen a different path. But the fact is, we can't go back in time. We can only look forward, and we must always be vigilant because it's only a matter of time before the possibility of genocide reemerges. And when it does, we cannot wait for God to step in and change the outcome. No, what the Holocaust has taught us is that if we don't act, if we don't stand up, if we don't speak out, then no one else will.
General Eisenhower liberated many concentration camps. He was appalled, and he said to his soldiers, "Take as many photographs as you can because the world will not believe this." So these are quotations from his remarks. I have never felt able to describe my emotional reaction when I first came face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard of every shred of decency. I visited every nook and cranny of the camp because I felt it my duty to be in a position from then on to testify at first hand about these things in case there ever grew up at home the belief or assumption that the stories of Nazi brutality were just propaganda.
A big thank you to Magda Brown for sharing her experience of the Holocaust. You can find out more about her story at magdabrown.com. I also want to thank Rabbi Lisa Bellows for speaking so eloquently about post-Holocaust theology and for making the introduction to Magda. I also want to thank Dr. Peter Lourgos for offering his insight into the science behind criminal behavior and the conclusions advanced by the Milgram experiment. Permission for the use of audio from the original Milgram experiment was granted by Alexander Street, a ProQuest company. Restorative Faith is a collaboration between myself and Rebecca Anderson, currently a student at Princeton Theological Seminary. The music in this episode was written by DP Music, Iconics Music, Smart Tune Music, TuneLight, Music Box, Roman Cano, Michael Musco, Eric McNerney, Brian Holmes, and Eden Epstein. For more resources on this and other episodes, please visit us at restorativefaith.org.
My survivor colleague Eva Gross, she writes, Hitler never died. He only slumbers. If, in any generation, at some part of the globe, a nation sinks into a slump, those with the loudest voice search for a scapegoat. Hitler awakens, wearing a different suit, shouting in a different language, but carries the same message of hate. Camouflage their shortcomings, the people are pleased to follow him.
Next time on Restorative Faith.
There was a ranger there, and I asked, I keep seeing these brown patches at different places in the forest. And he said, yeah, those are the pine beetles that are doing damage to trees. And he said, because it doesn't get cold enough in winter to destroy the first cycle. And so the pine beetle can have 2 life cycles, and the trees can't keep up.
Because if you really want to get in and address climate change, you might have to not only adopt some new technologies, but also change your behavior.
Nothing else matters but your salvation before God. If I am wrong about the rest of the earth, he says, then too bad. I made a grand mistake, but at least we'll be saved.